It's been over 20 years since Buffy the Vampire Slayer left our screens, but the mythology it built around the Slayer hasn't faded. If anything, it's become even more layered, with news of revival series in development and the casting of a fresh protagonist stepping into the role of the new Vampire Slayer. Now seems like a good time to revisit the Slayer legacy and unpack some of the most debated questions in the Buffyverse. Across the original show, its spin-off Angel, and extended lore in the comics, Buffy gave us a rich but sometimes inconsistent mythology. Fans have spent decades debating things like how Slayer power works, the effect on the Slayer line once Buffy died and came back, and what happens when a Slayer is turned into a vampire. I covered the Slayer as a concept in my previous video, exploring the origins, the Watchers Council's role, and the various powers and weapons a Slayer has at their disposal. Now, in this video, we're focusing on some mysteries or unexplained facets, each one drawn from long-standing fan discussions or contradictions in the canon of the show. As usual, this will go into spoiler territory for the series and also the extended comics and books, so heed this warning. However, before we dive into these, I want to spend a couple minutes on the recent Buffy news and bring you up to speed with what's so far been reported on the next upcoming chapter. In my last video, I mentioned that the Buffyverse is returning, but now we've got more details. First off, let's clear something up. It's not a reboot. This is a continuation of the Slayer's story. Hulu has greenlit a pilot with Sarah Michelle Gellar returning, this time as both executive producer and of course Buffy Summers. The new lead is 15-year-old Ryan Kira Armstrong, known for her roles in Firestarter, Star Wars Skeleton Crew and American Horror Story. Gellar even shared a heartwarming Instagram video calling Armstrong the only girl I wanted by my side, and producers have dubbed her the Chosen One. Oscar winner Chloe Zhao is directing the pilot and executive producing alongside Gellar and Dolly Parton's production company, with other Buffyverse veterans likely to return. The story is allegedly to centre on a more introverted high schooler, possibly echoing early Willow more than Buffy herself. Gellar's also promised a lighter tone, more like the show's early high school seasons. Naturally, fan theories are flying. Some say Armstrong is playing Buffy's daughter, others suspect the title is New Sunnydale, or there will be a multi-generational storyline with the aging characters alongside the younger cast. Not too dissimilar to Stranger Things. There's even talk of returning cast members, though how they'll explain Spike aging is anyone's guess. Whether the format will stick to the classic 22 episode run or follow modern binge trends is unclear, but one thing's certain, excitement is high. Gellar's adamant the show will only happen if it's done right. Whether it delivers a worthy new Slayer for a new generation remains to be seen, but the Hellmouth, it seems, never stays closed for long. Plus, there's also that one in Cleveland. Right, news roundup done. Now, let's dive into the real topic for today, some of the most hotly debated theories in Slayer lore. Let's get started. This is one of the most common questions in the Buffyverse fandom that I've seen. Why was there only ever one Slayer active at a time? And rightly so, as when you actually stop and think about the Slayer system in Buffy, things start to unravel fast. Like, sure, the show tells us there's one girl in all the world, destined to fight the forces of darkness. Very cool, very iconic, but practically, it's a total logistical nightmare. Let's consider this. There are apparently Hellmouths all over the world. As mentioned earlier, we're told there's one in Cleveland for starters. But we only get to see one Slayer at a time. And if you watched Angel Season 4 and the whole Jasmine arc, it becomes very obvious that LA was facing a full-blown apocalypse. And yet, no Slayer. The one person who's meant to handle exactly this kind of thing is nowhere to be found. Faith's off the table. We know she's back in Sunnydale at this point with the battle against the first evil, so from a Watcher's Council perspective, who's handling that situation? No one, apparently. That's the bizarre thing about the Watcher's Council. Dozens or likely hundreds of members, a whole institution, but for what? One Slayer? They're basically a massive bureaucratic nightmare built around micromanaging a single teenage girl with a stake. It's wildly inefficient. Why even bother having regional branches or a council at all if you're not assigning Slayers to different cities? The in-universe answer goes back to the origin of the Slayer line. As revealed in Season 7, the first Slayer, Sinea, was created when the Shadow Men forcibly infused her, a young girl, with the essence of a demon. That act of violation anchored the Slayer line to a rigid, mystical rule, one girl in all the world, chosen to stand alone. And according to fan discussions, this one-at-a-time setup wasn't just tradition. It was likely baked into the magic that bound the Slayer line. One commenter theorised that had they created multiple Slayers at once, they wouldn't have been able to sustain a continuous lineage. The power could fracture, the mystical balance disrupted. But even within the narrative, there's a sense that it wasn't just about magic. It was also about control. One Slayer is easier to manage. The Watcher's Council, massive, hierarchical and often paternalistic, only needed to monitor and manipulate a single weapon. Of course, it also reinforced the trope of the Chosen One, a powerful metaphor for individual destiny, sacrifice and isolation. This is largely because Buffy is equal parts comedy and drama, which uses the supernatural as a lens to explore its characters' emotions, a focus the writers correctly prioritised. Lore was always secondary to this, as they themselves attest. That's why the world building usually doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Supernatural activity doesn't just politely cluster around Sunnydale for convenience and the balance of light and darkness. Demons, vampires, hell gods, they don't exactly care about postcodes, or zip codes for my American friends. As fans have pointed out, it's laughable to imagine that one Slayer could globetrot her way to every demonic hotspot, especially pre-commercial air travel. Oh no, an apocalypse in Beijing? Pity the Slayers stuck in Bournemouth. Which brings us to one of the best insights from the community. Buffy was never meant to be the only line of defence. While the Slayer held a unique power, others fought alongside her. Witches, half-demons, covens, and even secret military programs like the Initiative. In Angel, the series, he becomes a champion chosen by the powers that be. In Gun, we see self-made vampire hunters, and in characters like Doyle, Lorne, and Illyria, we see other kinds of good demons or powers stepping in to hold the line. That's all well and good, but it still feels like a workaround for a system that should have had resiliency built in from the start. And sure, I get it. The one girl in all the world thing adds tension. The idea that if she falls, the world might fall with her. But would it really have hurt the storytelling to have a handful of Slayers spread out, each dealing with their own local threats, and occasionally converging for the big world-ending stuff? Like an Avengers Initiative, but with much more X chromosomes. I guess after the show, that's where the comics pick up. Instead, what we get is a lore framework that doesn't quite account for scale, global or logistical. And the result is, well, a lot of raised questions. Like, who was holding the line at the Cleveland Hellmouth during Buffy's time in the afterlife? What about before she was even called? In fact, even during her tenure, as let's face it, we never see her going there. There's a Reddit thread I found recently that captures it perfectly. A user chimed in with the idea of tiered Slayers, some trained, some potential, some stationed globally. One person even floated the idea that Slayers could be called, not chronologically, but geographically, when the need arises. That would have actually made the council much more useful. But hey, that's part of the charm of the Buffyverse. Messy systems, big lore holes, and the constant sense that it's held together with Hellmouth grade duct tape. And somehow it still works, just maybe don't think about it too hard. Who was the Slayer before Buffy, and why don't we know more about her? Despite an ancient lineage, the show tells us very little about the Slayer who came just before Buffy. Who was she, and why was her story left untold? In fact, there are only 2 references to her in the entire series run, the Master in Season 1 and Whistler in Season 2, and both simply comment that Buffy is prettier than the last one. That's it, that's all we got. Now, I guess it makes sense that Buffy herself wouldn't want to dwell too much on the tragedy of her predecessor. After all, it's got to be a gloomy thought, knowing your powers were inherited because another girl died. But in Season 5, Buffy actively begins researching the Slayer, even training with more focus under the guidance of Giles and later Spike, to better understand her role. This would have been the perfect opportunity to reflect on the Slayer who came before her, yet the show stays silent. No name, no Watcher diary, no dream or flashback. So it's left to tie-in material to fill in the gap. And this is where it gets complicated. You see, there are 2 conflicting versions of events. Well, actually, many more than 2 if we count the alternative universe timelines, which even includes a universe without Shrimp, and in that universe, Morgan Palmer is the Slayer preceding Buffy, but we will stick to the main timeline for this video. In the canonical Twilight comic in Season 8, we catch a blink and you'll miss it glimpse of a dark-haired girl fighting a vampire in a dim alley, moments before she dies. Artist Georges Jeanty confirmed this was intended as a nod to Buffy's predecessor, but we learn nothing else. No name, no history, just a visual. Contrast that with the far richer, though non-canonical tale of India Cohen. According to the novels The Book of Fours and The Tales of the Slayer Volume 3, in which her chapter is the story titled The Code of the Samurai, India was the Slayer active from 1993 to 1996. She was born in 1978 in North Carolina. Her father served as an officer in the US Navy, while her mother was a well-known actress in the Philippines. India sometimes questioned her parentage, suspecting that her biological father may have been someone her mother couldn't marry for undisclosed reasons. As mentioned, she was called as a Slayer in 1993 while living in Japan, where her father was stationed as a submarine commander. Alongside her Watcher, Christopher Botwell, whom she called Kit, India travelled across the country, battling vampires. Kit was described as young, handsome and a capable fighter, more James Bond than Rupert Giles. In fact, India and Kit had an unusual Slayer-Watcher dynamic. They were in love, though for much of their time it was unspoken, mostly because this was forbidden according to Watcher's Council rules. As far as I can remember from reading the book, he never confessed it while she was alive, but admitted his feelings to her ghost after her death in the Book of Fours, giving their partnership a quietly tragic postscript. After her death, he quit the council and became a recluse. In a somber moment, the book portrays Buffy's perspective in meeting Kit and hearing about India. Here's a small section of it. "It was wrong of her to sacrifice herself for me," he said, "a waste of her potential." "Well, she was a Slayer," Buffy said. "We do stuff like that. Not for your Watcher, nor one good friend," he said, giving her the eye, "nor for a lover. I certainly hope Rupert Giles trained you better than that." "I did," Giles said sternly, coming up beside him. Buffy remained silent. "For that reason, in terrible remorse, I withdrew from council matters. Since then, I've devoted my life entirely to the study of magic, to find her," He trailed off. Tears welled in his eyes. Because you wanted to bring her back, Buffy guessed. He lowered his head. I wanted to bring her back. That's understandable, Buffy said quietly. Do you have a picture of her? So I'll, recognize her? He slid his wallet out of the back pocket of his corduroy pants. Then he plucked a photo the size of a school picture out of the credit card section and handed it to her. A beautiful, Amer Asian girl smiled back at her. There was a startling intensity in her almond-shaped eyes. She has beautiful features and shiny hair. She looked smart and brave. What's particularly interesting about India's portrayal is how her Slayer experience differs slightly from Buffy's. In the Code of the Samurai, we see her in the early days of her calling, just 6 months in, developing her Slayer skills in Japan. Her relationship with Kit is less paternal, more equal. They fight side by side. Their connection founded as much in mutual respect and trust as duty. Although she did remind me of Buffy in that she is also quite sharp and witty, but also vulnerable too. Of course, she is still 15 at this point and has already accepted her fate that she will likely be dead in a few years. Then, in the Book of Fours, also written by Nancy Holder but in 2001 while the show was still airing, we learn that the main villain of the story has already killed her. So in her chapters, we are reading from the perspective of her ghost, who's trying to help Buffy and the gang from the same fate. It's revealed that after returning to California, she was hunted by a mummy called a Gatherer, and it captured her watcher Kit and her dog, Mariposa. To save them, she ultimately sacrificed herself, a painful, heroic end that echoes Buffy's own death in The Gift, although India's was more gruesome as she was hacked to death with an axe. Now, if we treat the Book of Fours as a piece of background lore rather than hard canon, which it isn't anyway, India's death is said to occur in May 1996, the same month Buffy was allegedly activated. But if we take the Season 8 comics brief nod seriously, that could imply an additional Slayer existed between them. The Slayer line supports this possibility, listing an unidentified Slayer with an unknown watcher, who also died in May 1996. It's entirely plausible that India's death triggered the calling of this unnamed Slayer, who was then swiftly killed, possibly within days or even hours, prompting Buffy's activation. So where does that leave us? India Cohen may be Buffy's immediate predecessor, or there may have been a brief link in this chain, a footnote lost to history, barely remembered. But of the two, it's India whose story gives us something more tangible, a portrait of a Slayer who was fierce and loyal, but sadly doomed. Whether or not she's canon, her presence adds weight to the mythology. Perhaps in the new series we will somehow see India's story told. Of course, maybe the new revival show will also retcon this whole thing. On that topic, I do think a series which focuses on Slayers of the past would be really interesting, given all the different time periods it could cover. But anyways, I digress. On to the next topic. One of the most baffling and hotly debated questions from fans in the Buffyverse is this: why didn't the Watchers Council ever pay the Slayer? Given the risks, the sacrifices, and the literal world-saving duties involved, you'd think there'd at least be a payslip or two to sweeten the deal. And yet, by the time we get to Season 6, Buffy, already brought back from the dead twice, is forced to juggle a dead-end job and looming bills just to keep her household running. From a practical standpoint, the council isn't broke. They're ancient, well-connected, and very clearly have deep resources. They train Watchers globally, have a massive base of operations in England, and fund field missions. They even agree back pay to Giles in Season 5's checkpoint, confirming that Watchers are salaried professionals. But Slayers? Nada. No stipend, no benefits, just the expectation to fight, die young, and do it all without complaint. So, what gives? One of the most popular fan theories suggests that the council deliberately keeps slayers financially dependent. To them, slayers are weapons, not people, tools to be aimed at the nearest apocalypse. Give them too much independence and they might start asking questions like, why do I have to obey you? Or, in Buffy's case, what if I just don't? The cruciamentum, that charming tradition where they drug and test the Slayer on her 18th birthday, is often interpreted in fan circles as a way to eliminate those who are getting too powerful or self-assured. If true, it reveals a chilling truth. The council would rather see a Slayer dead than insubordinate. Others point out the council's patriarchal foundations. This is, after all, allegedly a group formed centuries ago by men who forcibly imbued a girl with demonic energy. Over time, they built an entire institution to control that power, one girl at a time. Slayers like Kendra, raised within the council's structure, were seen as ideal, obedient, isolated, and devoid of personal ties. Buffy, by contrast, was a problem. She had family, friends, and even a vampire boyfriend. The council didn't want to reward that model, they wanted to discourage it. There's also a more cynical and meta explanation. Paying the Slayer would make her seem less like an ordinary girl and undermine the central metaphor of the series. Buffy's power is supposed to be a burden, not a career. She's not a superhero on a salary, she's a high schooler, albeit a high schooler with a stake in her purse and frequent cuts and black eyes. Giving her a paycheck, some argue, would have undercut the show's core tension, the struggle of balancing destiny with identity. So, to summarise the in-lore reason as to why doesn't the council ever pay the Slayer? Well, as one Reddit user put it, a carpenter doesn't pay his hammer. That's how the council sees her, not as a person, but as a weapon. How are potential Slayers located by the Watchers Council? Here's the conflict at the heart of the Slayer line. Some girls spend their whole childhood being trained for a destiny they might and probably never inherit. Others get ambushed by it in the middle of high school. Take Kendra, raised in isolation, drilled daily, likely handed a stake before she could spell it. Her entire identity was built around her being a Slayer, long before she became one. Compare that with Buffy, who finds out after school one day that she has been permanently assigned this sacred duty. So, what explains this inconsistency? According to the lore, the Watchers Council tries to locate potential Slayers before they're activated. Usually it's through mystical means, known as scrying. Similar to how people use crystal balls in divination and fortune tellers gaze into their future, the council would use these methods and attempt to identify or seek out potential Slayers. Other times it's just keeping tabs on girls who show early signs of strength or resilience. Naturally, the whole system is wildly inconsistent. Some Reddit theories, and they're hard to argue with, suggest a few other reasons for the varying experiences in the beginning parts of a Slayer's tenure, so let's look into them. Geography and culture play a part. Kendra seems to originate from a community in Jamaica where Watchers had influence and, as she says to Buffy, her family took the calling of a Slayer very seriously. Buffy, meanwhile, had a fiercely protective mother who was involved in her life and certainly would have rejected any request to let the council whisk her off to a Slayer compound for training. Magical limitations probably were also a factor as well. Scrying isn't flawless. The council's ability to track potentials is unreliable at best. Some girls simply wouldn't show up or don't get found in time. And finally, resource constraints likely impacted finding potential slayers. There are only so many Watchers to go around. Even in its prime, the council was stretched thin. Not every girl gets chosen, not every girl gets trained. It's triage, and sometimes it's biased towards specific locations or communities. For instance, I suspect that being based in the UK, they frequently caught the British potentials more than others because of the logistics and resources would have been spared for their local needs. They were unlikely to have spared the same expense for potential slayers based in Greenland, for example. And that leads to another question. What happens to the trained potentials who don't get called? Are they given other roles? Or are they just forgotten and have to go back into society like it was a very strange, extended dream? They've been versed in the forces of darkness. They now know what goes boo in the night and have been trained in martial arts. How can they go back to a normal existence with a college course or a desk job? The series never really tells us. I personally believe they likely folded in to support the council as members, maybe becoming Watchers themselves or field operatives, although given the council's patriarchal history, this was likely not an option for many of the potentials before the last 100 years. So, the truth is that locating a slayer is part destiny, part logistics, and seemingly part dumb luck. Right, so this one's been kicking around fan forums for years. How did Buffy's resurrection in season 6 break the Slayer line, and why did it let the first evil rise in season 7? There's canon, and there's a ton of brilliant fan speculation, so let's try and make sense of it all. What the show gives us is this: when Buffy dies in season 1, Kendra is called. When Kendra dies, Faith is called. After that, it's generally accepted the Slayer line flows through Faith. Buffy may still have her powers, but her death in the gift doesn't trigger a new Slayer because, well, the mystical line has technically moved on. That's backed up by executive producer Marty Noxon, who confirmed in an interview that you only get one transference, and Buffy already had hers. I guess this makes some sense when you think of the first Slayer, Sinea, and the powers that were bestowed on her were from the soul, heart and spirit of a demon, and so that power always survives through the transfer to another activated Slayer. But then that begs the question, surely Buffy would have lost her superpowers in that case if she lost the ability to be the active Slayer. However, I've always understood it that once you become a Slayer, it changes your chemical makeup. Your blood and body are forever tied to the superpowers and abilities of that legacy. So momentarily killing Buffy wouldn't remove the powers because they are part of her makeup, her DNA essentially. But it does make Buffy an anomaly, technically still a Slayer with all her powers, but not the vessel through which new Slayers are chosen. But here's where things get confusing. Well, at least more confusing. In season 7, Giles and Anya seek out the Beljox's eye, which cryptically states that the first evil's opportunity arose not because Buffy died, but because she lives again. In other words, her resurrection disrupted the natural order of the Slayer line. Crucially, it's also not stated which resurrection. And from there, the fan theories go wild. One interpretation, and one that seems to be the main consensus, argues that Willow's spell created an unstable secondary Slayer line because she used primal dark magic and forcibly yanked Buffy's soul from the afterlife. This differed from Buffy's first death, which was closer to a cardiac arrest, and therefore she was only clinically dead for a brief moment. A natural death and revival. The second resurrection was magic related and we know in the Buffyverse that magic use has consequences. It's interesting when you look at the words Willow uses in the resurrection ritual. Here lies the warrior of the people, let her cross over. That suggests she is the Slayer, not just a Slayer. It might be how the magical forces Willow invoked interpreted it, and thus reactivated her as if she were the active Slayer. Before this, although Buffy was a Slayer still, her revival didn't concern the first because her death would theoretically not lead to a new Slayer. Suddenly, there are two active Slayers with line potential. According to this theory, the first evil saw that the rules could be bent, and if they could be bent, they could be broken. That imbalance is what it pounced on. It recognised that if one resurrection spell could remake the rules, so could another. Although, I don't believe the first acted out of fear, but opportunism. I like an interesting online theory from a Buffy fan that the weakness the first was exploiting was the one we saw it take advantage of on screen, embodying Buffy, a living person, when normally it could only embody the dead. Maybe when Buffy was resurrected, it gave the first a connection to a living Slayer for the first time, which is what allowed it to tap into the magic of the Slayer line, track down their potentials, and wipe them out. But back to the idea of Buffy regaining her active status. It's hard to tell if the writers used the characters to try to get this across throughout the show, or they simply forgot that Buffy was technically not an active Slayer. For instance, way before Buffy's second death, the mayor comments that he didn't want his henchmen to kill any of the Slayers, as that will trigger a new one. Buffy then says in season 7, in one of her many speeches to the potentials, that her death will trigger one of them as the new Slayer. So, was she correct here, or was it that she believed that? There's also the complication that Dawn was created from Buffy's blood, well, at least according to Buffy, and some fans have speculated then that perhaps she would also need to have died for a new Slayer to be activated from their Summers bloodline. That's certainly quite a stretch considering she is not known to be a Slayer in any way, so it's not a theory I prescribe to, but it's still an interesting thought. There's another angle that might be my favourite, that Buffy's resurrection extinguished the entire Slayer line, both hers and Faith's. I found a particularly detailed Reddit post that posits the idea that Willow's act effectively nullified the trigger mechanism for future Slayers. Faith and Buffy still had their powers, sure, but if either of them died, no new Slayer would be called. The first, sensing this, made its move to wipe out the Slayer line permanently. That would then also make Willow's final spell in Chosen, using the scythe, even more significant, as it was then actually repairing what she broke, restoring and multiplying the Slayer line across the globe. In this headcanon, it's a redemptive arc for Willow and a poetic way of rebalancing the mystical scales. Of course, it does call into question as to why the first then felt the need to kill off the potentials, as surely if this were the case, they were just girls with no future to become the Slayer anyway. Maybe another Slayer was called after the gift. We just never saw her. She could have been activated in some remote part of the world and slipped through the cracks, or the Watchers Council identified her but just never let on to the Scooby Gang, which would be in keeping with how they operated. I personally like to think that a Glaswegian Slayer was called and was making our streets a little safer, closer to home. I will need to check if our mortality rate dipped around 2001 for this reason. The beauty of these ideas is that they can all be true at once. A new Slayer could have been called, so there is a replacement for Buffy, while Faith is still the Slayer, albeit in prison. And then when Buffy was resurrected, That brought her back into the fold as another active Slayer, meaning there could have been 3 of them. No wonder the first was desperate to put a stop to it. And if the fan theory I mentioned earlier meant the Slayer line was wiped out, that would still have applied to this theoretical third Slayer, although second really if you count Buffy coming back as the third chronologically. However, although the showrunners never offered a clear, unified explanation, this one was debunked. Some behind-the-scenes statements affirm that no new Slayer was called after Buffy's second death in The Gift, but they don't fully address the Slayer line's mystical mechanics. Still, the speculation persists online. I've seen commenters speculate that Season 7's Cassie was a potential Slayer because of her prophetic visions and insight. But I also think that limits the scope of the Buffyverse world. It's like child Darth Vader building C-3PO in the Star Wars prequels. Not everything needs to be connected. It's an interesting angle and thought, but I personally disagree with this one. Ultimately, the show leaves just enough vagueness to let all of this breathe, and frankly, that ambiguity is part of the fun. Okay, let's move on to the final piece of today's topics on Slayer lore that fans love to debate. So, we've seen Slayers die, we've seen them come back, we've seen them go rogue, go to prison, get possessed, even duplicated by robot. But there's one thing the show never fully explored. What happens if a Slayer gets turned into a vampire? It's a concept that's been floating around since Season 1's Nightmares, when Buffy literally dreams of becoming a vampire because it's her worst fear. A Slayer vampire. And yet, for a show that loves exploring dualities, life and death, good and evil, human and demon, we never saw the show actually follow through on this idea, which is a shame. Anyway, let's start with what we do know. Yes, a Slayer can be turned. That much is confirmed in the comics, where the term Slaypire is used to describe a Slayer who's been vamped. These Slaypires retain their Slayer strength and gain vampiric powers, making them incredibly powerful, basically uber vamps with a black belt. Buffy herself technically becomes one, sort of, in Nightmares, but since it's a dream state, she still has her soul and doesn't try to kill anyone, which raises the question, would a vamped Slayer automatically become evil like ordinary vampires, or would the Slayer essence resist? Likely the former, and the comics do explore this more fully. So why does a Slaypire retain Slayer powers? I've seen fan speculation arguing that they believe the Slayer powers are mystical and soul connected, so once the soul is gone, so are the powers. However, as I argued before when explaining why Buffy kept her powers after she had died and been revived, the strength and powers are physical and part of the Slayer's DNA, so the vampire version also retains them. Interestingly, there have been rumours circulating in fan communities for many years that Sunday from the first episode of Season 4 was originally planned to be a turned Slayer. This could have given us the exact kind of villain Buffy feared she might become, a mirror image just like Faith. But if true, it was likely scrapped because the dark alter ego had just been covered the previous season. I've seen that some fans believe that in Buffy lore, Sunday was a vampire slayer in her past, and that would explain why she was so difficult for Buffy to defeat, although you would have thought she would have mentioned it. Maybe it was too much too soon after Faith's arc, the previous season. Or maybe, as some fans argue, the writers at the time considered a vampire villain was not as narratively rich as the government using technology to combat the forces of darkness. Still, What a missed opportunity. A slayer turned vampire would have been really interesting and provided a terrifying foe, especially as the next big bad. Considering season 4's big bad, Adam, is one of the least popular from a fan perspective because the chemistry with Buffy is non-existent really. A Slayer turned vampire storyline would have allowed the writers to explore the Slayer legacy more fully and created real tension between the characters. They could even have restored her soul, and she could have been another Slayer fighting the good fight, but without any crosses or holy water for obvious reasons. And then there's the comics, with some stories delving into Slaypires. Simone Doffler, a rogue slayer, intentionally becomes a vampire by awakening Malachar, the old one who in the lore created vampirism itself, and then turns into a full-blown Slaypire. As a result, she's stronger than Buffy and much harder to kill because of it. So, having a slayer turned vampire is fertile ground for tantalising stories, although barely explored in the original series and instead it was left for the comics, Reddit threads and fan fiction to explore. And maybe it will be covered in the Buffy revival series. For me, it's one of the most fascinating what-ifs in the Buffyverse, because in a world built on chosen ones and supernatural warriors, the idea of that turning against itself, that's storytelling gold right there. So that wraps up today's deep dive into the wild, weird and often conflicting fan theories surrounding Slayer lore. But let's be honest, we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much more to explore, so this definitely won't be the last time we revisit the subject in this way. Let me know which theory stood out to you, or share your own thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.